Philippians in chapter 2. And we're going to be talking here, we're going to be starting in around verse 14, but we're going to be talking here about a lot about attitude. And this is really the attitude, Paul's been teaching us correct attitude for quite some time through example and all of these different things, but I want to really kind of stress a little bit of the opposite attitude that he tells us to avoid this morning. And so as we're looking at this, I ask my kids now and then, periodically, I was like, they'll be fighting or squabbling, something of that nature. Yes. But anyway, they'll be doing that, and I'll just really get after them. And I'll be like, what is the one thing that I do not put up with? And they know. They're like, fighting. And I'm like, well, why? And they know this too. They're like, because that's the opposite of godly behavior. And I was like, yes, exactly. That is the exact opposite. Like, if you are filled with yourself, with greed, with want, with everything that is all about you, you are in absolute opposite and opposition to God. And I'm like, this is just like something that I was like, there's really no punishment that I'll withhold to have you not turn out someone who is all about yourself. I was like, this is something that's super serious to me. And I put them to the test this last week. So we've been talking about going fishing, which is a test in itself if you take 5 kids fishing. But anyway, we've been talking about going fishing, and then the kids always, I tell them, all right, we'll go fishing tomorrow, And the kids always come to wake me up, and I'm like, go away, And like, we always talk about, we're going to get out there at sunrise, And then we always get out there, 8, 9 o'clock or something, It's always late. So I was like, all right, guys, I don't know if we've ever made it to take you guys fishing at sunrise, so we're going to make it. So we drove out, and we got to the lake at like 8 o'clock at night, and it was raining, and we weren't going to set up the tent. So we slept in the truck. And so Audrey slept on the back seat, and Simeon slept on the floor behind the seat. And then Job laid on the bench seat, half of it, and I laid on the other half, like up the door. And then Abraham laid on my chest. And that's how we spent the night. But there was a lot of, get your foot out of here, move it, hey, why, climb up, don't step it, ouch, like a lot of this, and like, it's hot, I can't breathe, it was pretty awful, honestly. It was brutal. I never once fell asleep. I'd turn on the car, I was like, AC, and I'd be like, I'm getting tired. I was like, if I fall asleep with this old truck running, we may all die, so I shut it off, and then I'll lay there, I'll immediate heat, and I'm just constantly moving a seatbelt out from under my back and squeaking over and moving, and that's got very little to do with it, but it was a definite test of everyone's patience. And the kids eventually fell asleep. But anyway, it tests your personal endurance, right? It tests what's inside of you and how much can you go through. And anyway, as we're looking at this week, just looking at a Christian life and what we ought to be. And really, this whole book has been so much about following the example of Jesus and how Jesus just lays down everything, right? He sacrifices everything and he puts us first, right? He's just in this great submission and this great letting go of what is his and laying himself down. And this whole book has been all about walk in those footsteps, follow after Jesus, take on that mindset, right? This has been like the core, the heart, the soul, the thrive of the book as of yet, right? That's what we've seen on and on and on. So when he does this, when Paul says what he says here in verse 14, he says, do all things without grumbling and disputing. I think, you could say, well, he just kind of throws that in there. It's just like a little, and do all things without grumbling and disputing. But I really think that I'm going to harp on this a little bit because I think it's a little bit more than just tossing it out there. I really think this is kind of a big key. Like he throws it in here, and as we look at the context, it's in kind of a very important place where he throws it out there, and he's like, whatever you do, guys, do not fight, do not quarrel, don't grouch, don't grumble, don't be whining and complaining. You got to do this without that, okay? He makes it really important. You cannot live your life that way. And he throws in there at a very key point when he says this, do all things without grumbling and complaining. And you know, I'm no doctor, not a medical doctor, not any sort of doctor, and to such a sad level that I was trying to think about symptoms, and I was like, you know, what are some symptoms that tell you, you know, something that you have internally, you know? I couldn't even really think of any. That's how pitiful of a doctor I am. But I was like, you know, if you have a cough, you're like, you know, you got some sort of lung issue or something, you know, you got something going on inside there. If you're bleeding, you know, I was like, this is how pitiful my examples were. But you had some sort of abrasion, some sort of like rubbing, some sort of irritation, like something caused that, you know. If you have, you know, swelling, it could be, you know, from injury, from bruise, from kidney problems, heart failure, like building up fluid, like all of these things, like a doctor would look at and they would be like, yeah, this symptom tells me something that's going on inside of you that we cannot see. And I think this is exactly what Paul throws out. When he says, like, grumbling, when I hear that, I think, yeah, when somebody is all about themselves and like me, I, myself, like, I think this is a symptom. It's a symptom of something that is not godly within you. It's a symptom of something that's going on bad inside of you. It's a symptom that tells you that there's something desperately wrong with your spiritual state of life, because all of this, like, just kind of this outflow of grumbling and complaining and this whining and fighting that's coming out of you, this disputing, it just shows that there's something wrong with your spiritual state. And you know, Paul tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians, he says, so long as they're quarreling among you, are you not merely he says, are you not merely of the flesh? And he says, not spiritual. He says, listen, he's like, when I see you guys fighting and arguing and like all this disputes going on, he's like, I can just straight up tell you, there's no spiritual environment here. Aren't you merely living of the flesh? And like Paul gives us all these examples about the fruit of the Spirit versus the fruit of the flesh. Like he's like, these are obvious things. So I think when he puts this in here, it's something that we should take very seriously when he says this. So then he goes on in verse 15. He says, do all things without grumbling or disputing. He says, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. So he says, listen, the world, what you're going to see is they're going to be like, nah, that's mine, give me it, you know who they are, they're going to, and he's like, they're going to be just all this grumbling and complaining, there's going to be all this fight and contention, there's going to be all this garbage, that they're just crooked, they're twisted, they're all on their own self, and he's like, but you are going to stand out. You will be different from the world. You're going to like shine as lights in this world. You're going to be like this bright light where it's like, oh yeah, they're doing it. I can see they're doing it. They're living the spiritual way. They're living in a spiritual life. They're living as they ought to be living. They're different. They're shining as lights. And we just think our Christianity is supposed to develop us and change us. We've looked at this in so many ways. What Jesus says, you know, it's like a seed growing into the ground and it produces whatever it produces. Either it's scorched by the sun and it dies, or it changes you, and it like a mustard seed, it goes in the ground and it becomes this giant tree. Like when salvation comes into you, it's going to transform the person you are, so that when somebody looks at you, they're like, oh, hey, they're like a bright spot in this dark world. They're like, and believe me, there's a lot of people filled with selfish, just all these yuck things. And if you saw somebody with these characteristics, they should be, in a way, a literal bright spot in the world. But he says that you're supposed to shine, and he says in this world, and he also says that you may be blameless and innocent, you know, and that we would be blameless and innocent children of God, that God would look on us and be like, yeah, like, you're not making me mad at this point. Like, you're blameless and innocent before me, the way that you're living. And, you know, as far as where this falls in, I think this is also important. Like what he was talking about when he said this idea of do not be fighting and quarreling, do not have this contention among you. We're in verse 14, but he said in verse 12 and 13, he says, therefore, my beloved, he says, as you have always obeyed, he says, not only in my presence, but much more so in my absence. He says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. He says, for it's God who works in you, both to will and to do for his good pleasure. And then he says this statement about doing all things without grumbling and complaining. And he says, when you're living your lives, and this comes on the heels of work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, because God's at work in you, and God is trying to develop you into the person he's trying to make you in. And he's like, you should be in fear and trembling because he's trying to make you into this person. And then he says, hey, as God's trying to make you into this person, listen, I don't want to see fighting. I don't want to see quarreling. I don't want to hear you grumble. I don't want to hear complaints. I don't want you, like, why? He would ask, why do I hear me, I, myself? Like, what is that? Because Christianity has laid down self, right? It's like this entering into Christ-likeness, like selflessness, to serve, to have your eyes on the goal, to like get rid of that me, right? And so this comes on the heels of like work it out when you're smoothing it out and figuring out what the Christian life is. Don't have any of this grumbling and complaining and this fighting and these sort of things in your life. And so as we're looking at this, he says, do all things without grumbling and complaining, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God. And he had also talked about this earlier in the book when he was talking about, what is going to make us like blameless and innocent children of God. Like if God is our father, just like me to my kids, you know what kind of makes me very upset. Here God is, and we're his children before him, and what makes us blameless and innocent before him? And he's already taught us this. He says in chapter 1, verse 9, and in verse 10, he says, this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and discernment, that you may approve what is excellent. And he says, and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. He's like, I want your love to be growing and growing and more, and like your love is going to offset that selfish nature, right? And he says that you'll be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, right? That when the day of Christ comes, when your Father comes, you're blameless before him, right? And this is exactly what he's saying here, that you may be blameless and innocent children before God. That you're living your lifestyle that it's like, yeah, that's the footsteps of Jesus. Yeah, you've put that greedy mouth aside and your own selfish will, and you're grumbling and you're whining about everything. Like you just put you aside. And now, when your Father looks at you, he's like, oh, yes, you needed to do that in order to live this life. You needed to put the complaining away. You needed to put the I, me, whiny, grumbling, all of that fighting, like me first. You needed to put that away in order to be standing pure and blameless before me, in order that I would say, yeah, this is what I'm looking for. And he's been teaching us this in this book. Really, if I were to take the time, it would take way too much time to tell you how much he's been teaching that in this book. It's been a very, very heavy thing in this book that he's been trying to get us to understand that. And when I think about grumbling and complaining, I think about the nation of Israel. And God said that he had given us the nation of Israel as an example, right? And the example of being brought out of bondage, brought out of slavery, where they're in captivity, and Moses leads them out, right? And he says this was given to us as an example. And it's a picture of salvation. The Bible also makes it clear it's a picture of salvation. That we're in bondage, we're in slavery, we're going to die, right? And he leads us out, and they get to the sea, right? And why'd you have to bring us out here? Right? Right? And then you could just about walk through and slap each one in the face, right? Moses was feeling it, right? He's like, when you're saved, you shut up. That's not a good word to use. But he's like, you get it? Like, when salvation comes, you quit your whining, right? It's an example of our salvation for the future. So, he parts the Red Sea and they go through. He destroys their enemies, right? Happiness? Whoa, no water. Where's the water? We're so thirsty, Moses. Did you want us to die out here, And it's like, Again, you could slap each one of them. What is the matter? With salvation comes like happiness, right? And he's like, okay, the rock pours water out from the rock. They all drink from the rock. This should be crazy. We're drinking out of a rock. It's flowing water. We're all quenched our thirst. We should be happy, right? This is also a picture of salvation, the Holy Spirit flowing through us, that Christ is a rock, a redeemer, all these things, salvation. We should be thinking we shouldn't grumble and complain, right? All this, no food, no food, manna from heaven, it goes on and on. Oh, manna from heaven, no, we should be happy. No, where's the meat, we're tired of this, whining, complaining, fighting. All these are examples, even bread from heaven. This is an example of Jesus Christ shedding his blood and his body, right? It's all salvation examples. And what were they supposed to do? Quit your whining and complaining and focus on the salvation that's happened, right? And so it's a constant theme through Scripture that we should be getting this, that we should not be quarreling, fighting, grumbling, complaining. And Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 10:9. He says, we must not put Christ to the test as they did. He says, and we're destroyed by serpents. And he says, and we must not grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. He's like, you can't. Just like now, he's like, you saw the examples, right? And when you're saved by the literal Jesus Christ, by his death, by his salvation, he says, you'd better not grumble and complain. He's like, did you see what happened to them? Just got to kill these people because they won't stop complaining, right? Like, what is the matter with you? You should be laying aside those sorts of attitude that you can live and walk in the footsteps of Jesus. You should be getting rid of those. You should be like, salvation, happiness, no more me, no more whining, no more grumbling, no more fighting, no more disputing, no more why me, that's not really fair to me. Like, no, none of that. That needs to go. That needs to be emptied because of salvation. It needs to be taken away from you. It needs to be emptied and removed. So he continues on and he says this in verse 16. He says that you would be holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. He's like, you guys need to grab a hold of the gospel, and you need to just hold on to that. That needs to be your life raft. You need to be hanging on to the gospel, which is going to take your focus off of all this me, me first, all this garbage. He's like holding on to the gospel so that in the day of Christ, I can be proud that I didn't waste my time on all of you guys. Because you developed, you worked it out. Like you worked out your salvation with fear and trembling. You put thought into it. You're like, yeah, salvation is this, so I am this. I grow, I flourish. I see the footsteps of Jesus. I walk in the footsteps of Jesus. I follow after Jesus. I take it on. It goes from a head knowledge to that your heart wants to follow Jesus. That on the day of Christ, Paul's not, well, I sure wasted my time with those people. I shared the gospel with them and nothing came of it. It was just whatever. They're just selfish. They're greedy, whatever they are. He says, I don't want to end this thinking how I wasted my time. And he says, this should really turn us to living with peace and love and understanding. Like it should be a huge altering thing to our life, and because we're gripping and holding on to that salvation. So in closing here, just this idea of holding fast, and Paul is focused on this throughout this letter. Hopefully you just remember it all. Hopefully you remember all the focus. Remember when he said in 2 verse 3, he says, do nothing of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others as more valuable than yourselves. Remember when he was telling us this? Like don't be all about you, but just turn to put others first. This is the idea he's been teaching. He says, let each of you not look only to his own interest, but also the interests of others. Remember when he was like instilling all of these ideas throughout the entire book, like this is the walk, this is the way to go. And I think really that's why I'm maybe harping on this little tidbit a little bit more than usual, because this is like he's brought up the destroyer of the Christian attitude. The destruction of the Christian attitude is when you're just like, oh, me, why? Because I like to have me first, and like I want my things, and I just, don't. Like I think, when I hate to be this hard on my kids, 4 illustrations in one day, but when there's a fight and somebody's like, ow, I'm like, listen, you're both in trouble. You're both in trouble, because Maybe somebody pinched you, but when I hear you beller, "Ow!" That's not Christ-like. Christ would not have done that. He would have been sad for their misbehavior. He wouldn't yell and say, "Me, me, you've hurt me, right?" No. And whoever pinched you, no, like terrible attitudes. You must not be self-centered in this Christian walk. You cannot be all about thinking about yourself and your own focus and me and you and how everything's going to be. You can't be like, "Oh, I don't want to be around that person. I can't stand that person. I can't deal with, like, everything needs to be fitting for my life." Like, that thing needs to go. And so you got to empty out the grumbling, the fighting, the quarreling, and how everything needs to work just right for you. And this is going to create a very peaceable individual who works well in the Christian life, who walks in the footsteps of Jesus well, who endured things with patience, right? And I just think this is just a huge understanding that as I even started this book, I told you, and I don't know if I brought it out as much as I maybe thought I would have, but I was like, this is going to be a book of joy, that you got to live in the joy of Christ. He says all this about joyfully living in Christ, but in a lot of it, he's telling us how not to live and how to have this true lifestyle, how to really walk in the footsteps of Jesus without having ourselves in the way. And so I just think it's super important that we understand that and don't miss it. Like we can't have grumbling, complaining, selfish nature in our way if we're going to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. We have to cut that out, lay it down, and follow after Jesus. So let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer this morning. Our God and Father, I just pray that you just help us to know and understand your will, Lord. This letter seems to have so much clarity, so much simple application for just getting and understanding that we would live pure and blameless before you, that we would be doing what you want us to do. It's so much clear illustration, Lord, for how we are to be and what we are to be, and we just thank you for it. And Lord, now we just ask that you just help us to apply it to our lives. That we would be who you want us to be, that we could show that sort of lifestyle and not have ourselves in the way and our own desire that we're tripping over in order to not be able to live like Christ, Lord. And I just pray that you just help us in these things, and I just pray this in your Son's name.